All right. Hello, everyone. I am back with my excellent friend, Dr. AP Canavan, and we are here today to discuss another archetype. It's part of our archetype discussion series. I believe it is episode 18. Wow. We're going to have to start.
Don't talk about the numbers of the episode.
Well, I haven't run out of toes yet, so we're okay. Yeah, this is very exciting. We're going to be talking about animal companions, which I think should be one that's near and dear to a lot of fantasy readers. But first things first, AP, how are you today?
I am doing very well, Philip. I'm enjoying see, technically, I'm on a break from YouTube.
Yeah, this is your break from YouTube.
So this is just obviously I can't stay away completely, but I'm enjoying my breakaway. I've enjoying the start of the new year, and I hope that the new year is being very good to you too.
Well, thank you. It is indeed. It is. I'm a little busier than I would like, but that's we won't get into the details on that, but things are good. Things are very good. And it is wonderful to be here today with you, of course. So let's talk about animal companions. First, before we give a bunch of examples, and of course, we do want to hear from our viewers as well about what their favorite animal companions are. But so we will give a bunch of examples. But first, I think it would be helpful to talk about what are the functions and what are the types of animal companions that we can sort of dissect a little bit here. So what are the types of animal companions and what do they do in literature? So do you want to start us off on some thoughts on those points, AP?
Well, there are obviously a number of different narrative functions that animal companions get used for, in much the same way that companions of any kind get used for. But if you think a fantasy world is usually defamiliarized, it's usually strange. And one of the things that allows a reader to feel comfortable in the world is if you have a hero and they have a pet, because that is something that a lot of readers can identify with. Their pet cat, their pet dog, their pet goldfish, or in my case, I have a pet fossil. It doesn't require an awful lot of upkeep. But when you have that, it's in Hollywood, there's a thing called framework for narrative called Save the Cat. And Save the Cat is basically in the first couple of minutes, you show your hero doing something good, i.e. saving a cat out of a tree, that kind of thing. But it establishes rapport between the audience and the character, that you can then have the character do a whole load of questionable things. But because initially you have that connection to them as they did a really nice thing at the start, and it doesn't have to literally be saving a cat. You know, it could be these two men are trapped and the door is going to have to close. I order you to do it. Oh, I don't care about your orders. And the hero runs in, endangers everyone, manages to rescue them, and averts the disaster. But 99.99999% of the time, that should have resulted in everyone dying. But because they're a no nonsense, flout the rules, they're going to do the right thing, even if it's, inconvenient. We then, as an audience, buy into that. Animal companions are a different way of doing it, because if you have someone who cares for their dog, and they are nice to the dog, it shows an aspect of character. It helps the reader bond with or invest in that character. And also it gives the character in scenes when they have no one to talk to, they can still talk to their animal companion, even if the companion is not talking back, which kind of brings us on to, I'll come back to that sort of relationship thing in a second, but sure. It brings us on to one of the types of distinctions that you can make, because we can think about animal companions and you go, oh, dogs, cats, dragons, horses, and list a whole lot of different types. Yeah. Or you can kind of categorize them in terms of sentience and non-sentience, the ability to communicate between the hero character and the animal, or an inability to have that two-way communication. And that sometimes is a really neat way of categorizing the two different groups, because on the one hand, if it is and I'm going to use a 4-letter word here to describe the animal, but it has nothing to do with their intelligence, but the inability to speak, dumb, that they have been struck that so they cannot speak to the hero. So like Harry Potter and Hedwig they don't sit down late at night and discuss, what happened in potions class.
Right.
But Harry can still talk to the owl. The owl just doesn't talk back. But there's a bond, a relationship, and it is sort of master and pet. And that's that relationship. But then you have sentient creatures that can communicate back.
Which fantasy can do, because it's fantasy.
Yeah. And fantasy does this a lot. So you have, and we'll get into a whole lot of the different examples of this, but it then is an additional companion fulfilling the same narrative role that any other sentient companion would do. So it's an additional person on the quest. But usually, because the communication is mind to mind, it is a much more intimate relationship between the hero and character. So it develops a very deep emotional bond.
Right. Yeah. It's wonderful. And speaking of deep emotional bonds, I think and you mentioned some very important narrative functions of animal companions and how they can help create investment for readers. And I think that they're a wonderful device in that sense. They're also, I think, a psychological device of a sort, because, and as in the real world, when you get a pet for your child, I grew up with dogs. I had dogs all my life. And I learned a lot about love, and I learned a lot about loss by having those pets that I grew up with. I grew to love my pets, and I had to deal with their deaths when they happened. And that was the first lesson I ever had in death, about mortality. And it was really an important thing for me to go through. And so I think what you have often in fantasy is you have the protagonist learning a lot about love and about relationships with the animal companion. And sometimes, often actually, there is also a lesson about loss involved, and that can be very devastating for the readers as well. You feel just as you do in real life with your own pet. If you bonded with that character and bonded with the animal companion, you feel that loss. So it's a really beautiful thing, I think, that animal companions serve this psychological function as well, to help us to wrestle with mortality and loss in our lives. So I think that's a beautiful aspect of it as well.
Yeah, and obviously, because fantasy quite often plays with heroic ideals, loyalty is one of the big aspects that comes into play that gets examined.
Yeah.
And having a loyal animal companion is, one of the ways that an author can play with that particular theme and structure. Yeah. But this touches on the thing that I was saying I was going to return to, the deep emotional relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in order to deal an emotional blow, when animal companions turn up in a text, it's almost like in the back of my head, a ticking clock starts as to when the animal companion is going to buy it. And usually in a scene where they are protecting the hero and sacrifice their lives for the hero.
Old Yeller. Yeah.
It is, we are talking about tropes. It is a very common trope for the animal companion to sacrifice themselves for the hero at some point, usually a moment of high drama. And that, because of the deep emotional bond that has been explored in the text, it's a way of, giving that moment of poignancy and grief and shock to a reader that the author has killed off an animal companion. They've killed off someone in the text. But in the grand scheme of things, and this is going to sound cruel and callous, they haven't killed off one of the acting characters. They haven't killed off one of the important characters for driving the narrative. They've killed off an ancillary character who there just so happen to be a deep emotional bond with. So your narrative arc can still continue. The animal companion is then being used as an emotional spur and drive for character development of the main hero, but very rarely is it tied to the plot development as people call it.
Yeah. Although I will say that dogs are the nicest people I know, but
Well, I find that personally offensive. I don't like you anymore, Philip.
All right. Well, perhaps it's time for us to get into some specific examples of animal companions, and we will. Do you want to start then with the more normal type of animal companion examples, where you have a character and an animal where it's a non-sentient, where they cannot communicate with words with one another? There are other ways of communicating, of course, but there are some great examples of particularly there are a lot of horses, I think. So the
Like
knight,
Black Beauty,
horse.
there was an entire series of books about
Yeah.
Black Beauty, which is,
Oh my
oh,
goodness.
look at this amazing horse. And and that ties into the cliche of the young girl and her pony sort of story. And there's a whole lot of those outside of fantasy. It's like an entire subgenre. But
Sure.
you also have that relationship between the warrior or the knight and their horse, and like we see an aspect of that, probably slightly more cruel and callous, or at least pragmatic, in The Witcher, Geralt and Roach.
Yeah.
And it's Geralt has a succession of horses, all called Roach, that every time one dies, and he feels bad. Roach died. Oh, that's terrible. New Roach. And it's just a continuation. But I think Geralt usually picks a mare rather than a stallion or a gelding, but always calls them Roach. So there's always this, as a reader reading through those books, you forget that it's not always the same Roach.
Yeah. Well, a slightly more idealized example might be Gandalf and Shadowfax from Lord of the Rings.
And as I said earlier, I think, if we're going to talk about Gandalf and his pets, it's usually hobbits.
Oh, now see, you're the one who's going to get in trouble, not me. I can see that. But yeah, so Shadowfax, I mean, come on. I mean, that's the paragon of horses right there, and they have a bond that is kind of fun, I think. But
and if you think of the mythic underpinnings of that, where you have Odin and, was it Sleipnir, that the idea of the warrior with their great steed, and together they accomplished all of these things, that quite frequently there's the storied mount, the famous horse that carried the warrior into battle. And again, like in a lot of fantasy, we'll have references to a hero riding around, and they have a specially trained war horse, or a special horse of some kind. Like Karsa in the Malazan series has a special horse, goes on a quest to get a special horse. In David Eddings' Belgariad, Hetar has the ability to communicate with horses, and then they find like the meat-eating horse variant. Eddings is a slightly dated text, but Hetar has this bond. It's why he's such a commanding horse lord, a great cavalry officer, because it's the warrior and the horse acting in concert.
That's a bit like Karsa, isn't it? And he always names, what's the name of Karsa's horse in Malazan? It's also a meat-eating horse, right? I wish I could. The name is slipping my brain right now, but
and I've just completely blanked on it as well.
Yeah. Huh. Oh,
well, that's embarrassing.
Oh, you keep going. I'll look it up. So yeah.
But so horses, like that's an entire sort of subgrouping of these relationships, and there's a really nice inversion or playfulness with it in C.S. Lewis's Narnia book, The Horse and His Boy, inverting the relationship, because of course in Narnia there are a bunch of the animals actually are, can speak, are sentient, have personality. So the horse kind of adopts the young boy. And it plays with that relationship of the animal companion. Here the companion is the boy, even though that's where the narrative perspective rests. But that's a lot of fun.
It's fun. And Havoc, by the way, is Karsa's horse. Ouch. Yeah, we'll
because every time it's when I see that name, it's Cry Havoc, Let's Slip the Dogs of War.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, so let's go to, well, there are other examples of other types of creatures. Let's probably treat them first, and then we'll go to the big, obvious fantasy animal companion, which, I think is akin to you in some ways. You being a critical one, right?
Yep.
So let's the first we'll do cute fuzzy things before we get there. How about Ged's otak, another example of an animal companion that is the non-sentient type, but there's a special bond that forms there. And this is in A Wizard of Earthsea. The otak named Hoig is the name of it, and it's a wonderful, in a way, it's a symbol of Ged's innocence, I suppose. And the moment, it's a bit of a spoiler for A Wizard of Earthsea, but the moment when he loses Hoig, I won't say what happens exactly, but is a certain rite of passage. It is a certain moment of maturation, or results in that at least. So that is another function, of course, of animal companions.
Yeah, and of course, like we have a bunch of dogs, and then usually in fantasy, if a dog isn't good enough, then you go, oh, a wolf. And if a wolf isn't good enough, then you go dire wolf, and it basically gets bigger and bigger. Gemmell had a bunch of dogs and wolfhounds and things like that, and that ties very much into the medieval lord with the sitting in the keep with these giant wolfhounds, basically as the animals that they kept. Yeah. And we see a lot of that. And again, Karsa with his dog.
Yep.
You remember the name of the dog?
Oh, come on. No, I don't. No, I don't. Oh well, we'll be told in the comments. But yeah, no, wolves are big. So you mentioned there's of course A Song of Ice and Fire with the dire wolves, right? Especially Ghost and Jon Snow and all of that. And there's a bond there that goes beyond the normal, where they inhabit the beast. And that is something you see also in of course, Realm of the Elderlings in the Farseer trilogy with Fitz and Night Eyes. One of the most popular aspects of that trilogy, I think, is the relationship between Fitz and Night Eyes. And that's a step beyond the normal bond between a human and an animal, where there's the human inhabits the creature. There is a kind of blending of minds that happens in this case. And that's an aspect of fantasy that you see a lot. And there can be lots of different creatures that this happens with, but wolves are a very popular one, I think, right?
Yeah, and like Wheel of Time, Perrin being a wolf brother, and exactly. That whole aspect.
Yeah.
And you can see a lot of the wolf thing and the dog. It relates to having a dog, but wolves are just cooler, which is because they're more powerful, this sort of thing. And you can also see the sort of the slightly more Anglo-centric or Eurocentric perspective, because if you think of other parts of the world, it's you don't have as many stories where the animal companion is a coyote, or and there are certain animals, even though they fulfill almost the same sort of evolutionary niche or ecological niche, are considered noble sort of animals as opposed to pests.
Right.
And wolves obviously considered pests a lot of the time, but there was a level of nobility to them.
Right.
So that's interesting, but it also ties into the whole history of shape changing and werewolves, and part, I think, of that bond that we see, particularly in fantasy, where the hero can inhabit or ride along or feel what the animal is feeling, ties into that psychological. The hero is meant to be human and of the intellect, and then the animal is about the animalistic, bestial, simpler side. That the hero is overcomplicating things, and the animal companion is there to go, no, but there's a simpler way. When you need to eat, when you need to poop, when you need to sleep. That the animal has a much simpler and more content way of perceiving the world, which gives the hero a different perspective on problems.
Yeah.
And that gets played into in fantasy as well, because not only Robin Hobb, Wheel of Time, so Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, Jordan's Wheel of Time,
to some degree in A Song of Ice and Fire as well.
Song of Ice and Fire, particularly with certain characters practicing that skill, that magical ability. Was it warging?
Yeah, and I guess in Realm of the Elderling, it's the wit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's called by various names, but the beast magic, basically. Yeah.
Beast magic. And then companions like a falcon or a kestrel or some sort of bird of prey, like a kestrel for a knave, being a non-fantasy example.
Right.
But again, this sort of bond with the beauty and power and simplicity of something in nature, giving the human a different perspective on their lives. And again, we see that hawking and falconry, all those sorts of pursuits, again, associated with a noble aspect rather than ignoble. But Odin had 2 ravens and 2 wolves, so there's a mythological aspect tying into it as well. So there's a long and storied history of animal companions and of shape changing in various ways. Berserkers and the idea of even a turning into a bear or into a wolf or into a man bear, not a man bear pig, but a man bear.
Yeah, berserkers being literally means bear shirts, and then there were wolf hides with the same principle essentially. But I think that one thing you mentioned is important, and that is that the animal companion is often a source of consolation to the protagonist. You see that especially with Fitz and Night Eyes in the Farseer trilogy. Another great example of that is John Gwynne is actually one of the best, I think, writers when it comes to animal companions. That is a real drawing point for his writing for me. And the big example there is Corbin and Storm. Storm is what he calls a wolven, which is essentially like a dire wolf. It's a giant wolf, with almost like tusk-like, saber-toothed tiger-like teeth almost. But that's a great example of a really important relationship that is a source of solace to the protagonist, and not just in terms of being protective and getting the hero out of trouble during certain moments of danger, but also just being a constant psychological help to the main character. So, and you see that obviously with Jon Snow and Ghost and with other, and Fitz and Night Eyes and all of that. Gwyn also has talking crows, Craft being one of the most famous, and they're kind of fun. But he also has in his second series in the Banished Lands. So he has The Faithful and the Fallen is the first series with 4 books, and then he has a trilogy that follows that of Blood and Bone. He's got a great bear companion in that one, and its name is Friend, which is it sounds so simple, but it's such an apt name when you read the story, and it's just beautiful. Bears make great companions too, I suppose. But
yeah. And if you think in Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials.
There you go. That's another level. Yeah.
Getting into a sort of almost metaphysical, where the animal companion is, part of the soul, it's part of the spirit, that there's this point of connection. And we see something similar to that in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson and the Spren.
Yeah.
That again, it's using these, and we're moving now more into the sentient aspect of it. That again, they provide a companion, someone for the hero to talk to, someone for the character to talk to, and if they can then talk back, but you can have a dialogue, but you don't necessarily need to have a forced dialogue between 2 human people. And because of the intimacy of the bond, you can have the hero be a lot more vulnerable or a lot more open about the things that they're willing to discuss, because they have this special bond with the companion.
No, that's wonderful. So I think we are ready to get to the big leagues here now. And we've talked about dragons before in this series, but we haven't talked about them as companions specifically. And there's a rich tradition of dragons and dragon riders and all that sort of thing in fantasy, from Aragon to the Pern books and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of examples of dragons being animal companions outside of maybe wolves, the most popular one, I think. Maybe some hawks and that sort of thing. Dragons are, who wouldn't want to have a dragon companion? I mean, come on, really.
Um,
Right?
what was the old Disney movie? Was it Pete's Dragon?
Oh yeah, Pete's dragon. Yeah,
Or The Never-Ending Story, Falcor the Luck Dragon.
yeah,
But Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern, like
yeah.
the whole of the Pern series goes very deep into the bond between the rider and the dragon.
Yeah.
Melanie Ron's was it Dragon Prince? Was it Melanie Ron
I'll look it up.
or but again, a bunch of series where dragons are not only winged transport, but have a point of connection to the rider.
Yep.
And then we see that even in the Dragonlance Chronicles, where there's good dragons and evil dragons, and the cooperation that they are recognized as individuals, but there's a cooperation between the rider and the dragon, that they're not necessarily pair bonded, but they work together.
Right.
And dragons, Naomi Novik's Tremerary.
By the way, you were right about Melanie Ron. It's Dragon Prince. Yeah.
And His Majesty's
Pretty sure you're
Dragon.
wrong with that pronunciation, though.
Me and pronunciations never go well. But the first book of Naomi Novik's series that I can't pronounce is called His Majesty's Dragon.
Yeah.
And again, sentient dragons that develop a relationship with their rider. And I think there was a relatively recent one that was at the Priory of the Orange Tree, I think had a similar sort of aspect to it as well.
Okay. I haven't read that yet.
So, this is not an unfamiliar sort of pairing.
Right.
And sometimes it's much more to do with whether the dragon is considered an entity in its own right, their own right. Or if the dragon is more of a steed that bonds with the human rider, and all of the different levels sort of between that that you can have. Because you don't think of Smaug and sort of go, oh yeah, would it be great to be friends with him?
No.
Obviously we discussed dragons being very, very different, used different ways and having different traditions. So there's a lot there about dragons in fantasy and who they decide to side with or who they decide to help.
Yeah. Although I will say Ursula Le Guin in the Earthsea books, the later ones, not the first one, not a Wizard of Earthsea, where dragons are more antagonists, but you get into it later and you understand that, without spoilers here for it, but you understand that dragons are an aspect or related to humans in ways that are unexpected, and from the human culture and language and magic and so forth. So she does something interesting. I think she takes that to a different level as well in the later Earthsea books, particularly in Tehanu, I think. So very cool. And then of course there's Aragon and the Inheritance Cycle books with was it Seraphina or was the dragon? Do you remember? Okay, yeah. Well, he takes a lot of these things that have been done and rolls them into his story, I think, in a way that's very accessible for younger readers. So popular series. So yeah, it's not just the heroes though, right? Who get animal companions. Sometimes, hello, Voldemort and Nagini. And it's interesting the choices that are made for the villains when they get animal companions. They tend to be more scaly, I guess, than fuzzy.
Classic sort of example of this. James Bond's arch nemesis Blofeld has a pet cat. And it's that thing, okay. Oh, Mr. Bond, and it's bizarre that this is the sort of thing that you go, well, hang on, that should humanize him, but for some reason it just makes him really creepy. Yeah. But if you think of the number of villains associated with spiders, Sauron and Shelob, or associated with snakes or snake-like reptile creatures, and you mentioned Voldemort, right. When you should really think, Harry, given that he can actually talk to snakes, should probably have a snake that he could talk to, but
Yeah.
snakes are evil, apparently, and
Poor
the hero can't
snakes.
have a snake.
Yeah, they get a bad
Um,
rap. Yeah.
and if you think when we briefly mentioned like the idea of werewolves, the bestial nature, but in a lot of vampire stories,
Uh-huh.
the vampire turning into a vampire bat or into rats, things like that, that are parasitical or spread disease or have very negative connotations, that you can clearly see why a lot of villainous characters, one of the ways to signal that they are villains and evil is that they have evil pets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jabba
Well,
the
you
Hutt
can,
had a rancor,
there you go. I mean, come on.
but there's a beautiful moment in Return of the Jedi after the rancor is dead, and Luke's saved and he's run off, and it's great. You see the trainer
Oh,
crying
yeah.
because that was his pet.
I
That's what
know.
he loved. And it's one of those rare moments in
Yeah.
a George Lucas story that actually shows the different side to the narrative of,
Humanizing Jabba the Hutt. Yeah.
well, not Jabba, but one of Jabba's servants.
Oh, his servant at least. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a great moment. I'm really glad they kept it in. I'm very surprised that
Me too.
Lucas kept it in.
Yeah. Poor guy. Yeah. But and there we talked about this already, shape changing, and we see this in the Malazan series with the Soul Taken and the Divers, and of course there's Grillin, the rat thing. Talking about, you talked about rats, that made me think of him. That's his name, right? Grillin, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness, yeah. But of course you can turn. Some people are soul taken, like Anamanda Ray can turn into a dragon. So there's some cool things that Erickson and Esselmont do with this whole thing about animal companions, or they totally blend it, of course, with the Soul Taken and the Divers, don't they? Yeah.
And
They go
again,
all the way.
it's that other narrative element of showing the dichotomy of the sort of the conscious intellect versus the bestial nature of us as creatures.
Yeah.
And it's a nice way of demonstrating that dichotomy. And so it's a lot of fun when you take either using an animal companion or you have someone turn into the animal or ride along in the animal's mind. That's what it a lot of times it's playing with. And,
Absolutely. So that idea of the beast within us. And you see that with, Fitz. And if he does too much of this with the wit, he starts becoming, the creature. And that's something that you see a lot in fantasy as well, with playing with this theme of and Perrin in Wheel of Time and that sort of thing, becoming the wolf, so that dichotomy within us, and sort of a very cool way of pointing out our connection to the rest of the world as well, isn't it? Yeah. So excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think we've covered animal companions pretty well here, our furry and sometimes scaly friends and feathered friends. But it's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure that our viewers will have some additional examples. What are your favorite examples of animal companions, everyone? Leave some comments. Also, if you have other ideas about the purposes that are served by animal companions in stories. So AP, thank you so much for this discussion. As always, it was an immense pleasure talking with you.
thank you very much for having me on your channel once again. It's always nice to come by and do these things.
Oh yeah, yeah. Is this our first video together of 2022?
I believe so.
Oh, well then, Happy New Year, my friend.
And a happy new year to you too.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.